Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Just waiting a few seconds until everyone is connected. I see slowly participants are joining. Just a few more seconds to everyone. And then we can also put up the slides. Great. So a very warm welcome, everyone, to this webinar hosted by Real World Evidence for Decisions. My name is Alina Pavel. I am part of the Secretariat of Real World Evidence for Decisions, which is provided by the European Public Affairs Organizations, FIPRA. Today, we will explore how HTA bodies collaborate in the Nordic European countries and the role of real-world evidence to support their decision-making. Let's begin with a few words about real-world evidence for decisions, which is an HTA payer-led multi-stakeholder learning network focusing on the challenges posed by highly innovative medicines. Many of these medicines show great promise in areas of high unmet need, but are often presented with immature clinical evidence and high prices. This can lead to important uncertainties when pricing, reimbursement, and access decisions have to be made. The mission of real-world evidence for decisions is to bring together experts from all stakeholder groups to discuss how real-world evidence can be used to resolve some of these uncertainties or fill those evidence gaps. We host invitation-only roundtables and public webinars like this one today, where stakeholders engage in dialogue about how fit-for-purpose real-world evidence can be generated over the life cycle of highly innovative medicines through a few bullet points here. Horizon scanning, identifying medicines most likely needing real-world evidence, identifying what real-world evidence is needed to inform HTA and payer decisions, clarifying how real-world evidence is generated by health technology developers and how these will be assessed by HTA and used by payers and decision makers, and as well, importantly, planning and execution of post-launch evidence generation studies. We are guided by the principles of collaboration and transparency, and consider questions like how do we get good quality real-world data, how do we build trust in real-world evidence, and can we co-create processes that generate robust real-world evidence. These multi-stakeholder discussions began several years ago, led by the Belgian payer INAMI, and became formalized into the RWE for Decisions Learning Network in 2019. We are now led by a wide range of stakeholders who freely offer their time in the steering group to direct our work program and get involved practically in the work. You can see individuals from HTA bodies and payers, insurers, clinicians, patients, academia, analytical experts from Europe and North America. Experts from the trade association UCOPE and the range of pharmaceutical companies are involved and are funding the secretariat. So that was about real-world evidence for decisions, and now some housekeeping for today's webinar. Today's webinar is scheduled for 1.5 hours with a mix of presentations and panel discussions. There will be plenty of time for you to provide input via the Q&A function in Zoom, and the recording will be available on our website. We will also share a written report later on. Without further ado, I am delighted to be joined today by our two brilliant co-moderators from the Real World Evidence for Decisions Learning Network, Tove Holm Larsen, who runs Sylvie AI and is also professor at the University of Ghent, and her co-moderator, Alexander Natz, who is Secretary General of the European Confederation of Pharmaceutical Entrepreneurs. Alexander, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alina. It's a great pleasure to be here to today look at the real world when it comes to real world evidence. And it's really my pleasure to announce in a minute the first speaker, because what we're going to do today is looking at the Joint Nordic HTA Bodies, JNHB, which was formerly FINOSE, if I understand correctly. And it's my great pleasure really to announce the first speaker. And it is so important to speak about what is done in the Nordic country, because it's a practical example how real-world evidence is used and is shared among HTA bodies and decision makers. So it's my great pleasure to welcome the first presentation from Dr. Im Andersen Galjetovic to present us an overview about the JNHB initiative, the aims, the genesis, and how it is working. Thank you very much, Im, for being with us.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you all hear me now? Yeah, so I will start by giving you an overview of the Joint Nordic HTA Bodies, also called JNHB or even Joint Nordics, and a description of how the collaboration works. So next slide, please. The collaboration was actually started back in 2017, and it was called FINOSE, as you say, and it was a bottom-up initiative started by Finland, Norway, and Swedish authorities. And then during the later years, it has been developed into also including Denmark and Iceland. So now it includes all 5 Nordic countries, and it's been renamed into Joint Nordic HTA Bodies. Next slide. So when talking about the JNHB collaboration, it's important to understand what the collaboration covers. And it covers only the HTA part of a whole process of decision making when introducing new medicines. So, and this is because we have identified that our processes and methodology across the Nordic countries are very similar for HTA. And we all see this as an independent scientific process where we work independent of companies and the negotiators, and instead we use the input from clinical experts about the disease background and treatment and so on. And in all countries, it's also the companies that deliver the evidence, and the decisions are made on a national level. So the price negotiations can be either national or Nordic, and the Joint Nordic if the company and the negotiators decides that this is the way to go forward. But this is essentially outside the JNHB collaboration, which only covers the HTA part. Next slide, please. We should see this collaboration as a gathering of the best practice from the Nordic HTA bodies. So by sharing the knowledge, we think we aim to have even a higher quality and a similar quality of the assessments across the countries. And we also hope that by sharing the work, we can share resources in the future. By doing this knowledge sharing, we also aim for more convergence of HTA methodologies and the evidence requirements. And we also think that a joint Nordic assessment is a strong signal of intent and also a way to facilitate a more equal access for patients across all the Nordic countries. And this is because we assess the medicine simultaneously, and we also use the same evidence base and then obtain a similar common value for the medicines. But of course, there are also other factors that influence the ultimate decision, and this is outside of JNHB. Then we plan to update our processes to the upcoming HTA regulation, and Maria will talk more about this later. We also support the joint Nordic price negotiation when this is relevant and when it's agreed between the company and the negotiators. So all in all, we think that it's a flexible system that's beneficial for both the companies and also for the HTA bodies. And next slide, please. We have some background documents in the collaboration. The Memorandum of Understanding is the basis of the collaboration, and it defines the scope and legal basis. Then we have the waiver of confidentiality, and this should be signed by the company when engaging with JNHB, and it allows us or the HTA bodies to share confidential information during an assessment. And it also allows the price negotiators to receive the unredacted reports. And when we talk about confidential information in this regard, we are not referring to confidential price information, because the JNHB report is based on public available prices. So it's more likely that there could maybe be some confidential information, for instance, unpublished data or study reports, etc. So confidential price information is not part of this, because it's based on public prices. Next slide, please. So we have, when we had the new name, we had also made a process guideline to make it more a better description of the process. Of course, it's beneficial for ourselves, but also for the HTA developers, HTDs engaging with us. So the process guidelines defines the process steps and the timelines, and also the roles and responsibility. And it can be found on the homepage, where we also have Q&A section, where all the questions that we have been asked, at least all the most common ones, we have tried to gather them and to provide the answers also available on the homepage. If you go to the next slide, then to give an overview of the roles and responsibilities, then we have for each assessment, we assign an assessor and a co-assessor, and this refers to HTA bodies, not to specific persons. And then the other HTA bodies, they can be either reviewers or even observers if they do not plan to use the report, or for instance, if it's outside the remits of the HTA body. So the assessor has the responsibility for contact with the HTD, and also with coordination of the process, and making sure that the timelines are kept and that we finalize the report. Usually the assessor will also have either the medical or the health economic part of the assessment. And then the co-assessor will have the opposite role, either the medical or the HE part of the assessment, and they will collaborate together to perform the draft reports. And then we have the reviewers will review the draft several times and comment on the draft. And the observers also have the possibility to comment and read the report, but this is on a voluntary basis. Next slide, please. Then we have also prepared a submission dossier template, which should give guidance to the companies on what information we need for Joint Nordic HTA. So it supports the company in their submission, and it also gives a guidance, especially on how to include the national requirements in the health economic model. And again, we also have the question and answer section on the webpage, where you can maybe find answers to the most common questions that we asked. In the next slide, then we have just some bullets explaining the major parts. I think it's important to say that we would like to have one health economic model and the same health economic model structure for all countries. And then the model should be flexible enough so we can adjust it to all countries. So we do not have separate model for each country, but we have one model that is flexible to adjust. So it should also allow an easy way to get results for each country. And we have also suggested on how you could do this. And this is, of course, just a suggestion, but it could be in the form of, modeled in the form of a drop-down menu to allow the assessment team to switch between the settings and the model, to switch between the different country-specific settings. And in the dossier template, you can read a lot more about how to do that and for which specific parts we need country-specific input. Next slide, please. Then we have an overview, a more detailed overview of the process here. So we have the starting point is the request for assessment. So this means that the company sends to us a request for assessments where they describe the Nordic treatment landscape and signs the waiver of confidentiality. And we use this request to see if the product is suitable for a joint Nordic assessment. And the main criteria is that the treatment landscape or the comparator especially has to be similar enough for us to collaborate. Because if we have 4 different comparators, it may not be feasible to do a joint assessment, because then we're actually doing 4 assessments anyway. So the treatment landscape is the most important thing, and it should be, it doesn't have to be exactly similar, but it should be similar enough for it to be feasible. And this is what we can have a meeting about, to discuss if it's similar enough. And we can also use this dialogue meeting to discuss specific questions or input into the submission. For instance, how to model the country-specific input and so on in the model. So we are very interested in having these dialogue meetings if there is a company that is interested in a Nordic assessment. Then after the submission, we have the assessment starts, the actual assessment work, and we are aiming for 90 days for finalizing the assessment, the relative effectiveness and health economics. And the joint report is written in English. And we have also decided that the HTA body doing the health economic part, it will be the currency of that country that will be reported in the report. And then we have the national steps in parallel, and the national steps are mainly due to reporting the results in the currency of the other national countries, or in all countries. And then you can also have a summary of the national language. And of course, if there anything particular relevant only for one country, it can also be described in this national appendix. And we aim for finalizing this appendix at the same time as the report. And then the report is used for decision and negotiation in the various countries. Yes, I think that's this the overview I would like to give on how it works. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that was really an excellent overview to see about what is done and what is not done. It's always important to differentiate what is in scope and what is not in scope. And I think it's also quite relevant for all of us, including the colleagues from industry, to understand what is in scope and when can we reach out and so on, and in order to see if the product is eligible. We would now move on to the second presentation, and that's a presentation of Dr. Maria Eriksson. Maria is a medical assessor in TLV in Sweden, and she will focus on the journey from FINOSE to JNHB, looking at also at the EU HTA, the HTAR perspective. So I think that's going to be a very interesting presentation as well, to see where there is overlap with the EU HTA and how you're dealing with that, but also to shed some light on the travel from FINOSE to the new collaboration. Thank you very much, Maria, for being with us.
Yeah, and thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this seminar. Yeah, you could go to the next slide, please. And just as Alexander described, I'll try to give an overview from FINOSE going to JNHB, and both giving the national Nordic perspective and also the connection to the regulation. So next slide, please. Okay, so TLV is a governmental agency under the Ministry of Health and Social Affairs, and we have a quite broad remit, which includes both the dental care and the supervision of the pharmacies in Sweden. But what is relevant in this context is, of course, the value-based pricing that we do in my unit, where we do conduct the health economic assessments. And we at TLV, we make decisions on price and reimbursement for outpatient products, and we conduct HTA for products for hospital use. And our remit covers both medical products and medical devices, but for the Joint Nordic HTA body assessments, we only do medical products. So next slide, please. So in Sweden, we have 2 different processes for inpatient and outpatient products. So for outpatient products that we in Sweden define as everything that you collect yourself at the pharmacy, then the company needs to apply for reimbursement through TLV. We perform the HTA assessment, and then our board decides on price and reimbursement. And we have a possibility with the price negotiations that will be between the regions and the company, applying company. And for the for the hospital products, we do HTA assessments, but then we do it as a request from the regions and the NT Council that they ask for HTA assessment for a specific product. And then we deliver the report to the regions and NT Council. And if there's a price negotiation, that would take place between the NT Council and the company. And then based on that, the NT Council gives recommendation to the Swedish regions of how to use the product. So that's the basic of the Swedish system. So if you go to the next slide, please. So the connection then to the Nordic, Joint Nordic HTA, it's basically the same, but then the HTA, or the scientific part of the work, this is done on Nordic level instead of on national level, but the other steps remain the same. As M mentioned, there is a possibility for Nordic price negotiations for suitable products. And this is on a voluntary basis where both the company and the Nordic countries decide that this is of value for the specific product. So doing the HTA on national or Nordic level has, the assessment itself follows the same methods and is basically the same, but then the Nordic assessment will replace the national assessment. So please, next slide. And as M mentioned, we could add a national appendix for each country. So I've given an example here what this could include from the Swedish perspective. And we would like to have a summary of the joint report in Swedish. And we have chosen to have quite a short summary of a couple of pages, summarizing the main findings and conclusions of the joint report. We would convert the currency into Swedish kronor if it's another currency. And if it's something specific that is only relevant in the Swedish national perspective, this would also preferably be put in the national appendix rather than in the joint report. And we do calculate the severity of disease a bit different between the countries. So this is something that we would also prefer to have in the national appendix. And if the price negotiation is on national level, this is not part of the joint work, but this will be then only a national work and also part of the national appendix. And that's after the joint work has finished. And for outpatient products where TLV decides on price and reimbursement, we'll also have the decision document in Swedish. And this is the Swedish documents are published on our national webpage. And as far as possible, we want to have the national part in parallel to the joint Nordic part to not delay the process. Next slide, please. So the main differences between FINOSE and JNHB, I tried to list them, and I think one of the major differences is, of course, that we have gone from 3 countries to 5, which has a quite large impact on the collaboration, and in a very positive manner, with both resources and knowledge in the group. And we have developed the supporting documents to clarify roles, responsibilities, timelines, etc. And having this documentation, it really makes us better equipped to reach our 90-day goal for an assessment. And also the transparency of the work is important to us. So we set up our joint web page, and we have a joint email address to make information more accessible for the industry and companies that engage with JNHB. But also I think it's the work now going from 3 to 5 agencies collaborating in this. It has had a large impact on the work, and we see it as a continuous development of the collaboration, and we learn as we go. And the documents that are now published on our webpage, we got the feedback from the pharmaceutical industry, organizations in the Nordic countries, and we'll use this feedback when we update the documents. I think this is also an important part of developing the joint process and work in to have an efficient workflow. Next slide, please. Okay, so a bit of with the connection to the HTA regulation, and I think as most of you know, the regulation will be implemented stepwise from January 2025, and the first products that are affected by the regulation is oncology and ATMP products. So next slide, please. This is kind of the structure of the work at EU level, the different groups that are under the European Commission and the GSANT. So we have the coordination group and the 4 working groups for methods, JCA, joint scientific consultations, and emerging health technologies. And then also the committee on HTA working with the implementing regulations. And in all of these groups, we have representatives from the JNHB, who are members from our agencies that participate in the work, in the meetings. So we are kind of very much engaged in this, also from the JNHB group. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is one part, what we do at the EU level, and then also it also has, of course, a large impact on the preparatory work on national level. But before the work with the regulation, several members of the JNHB group was involved in the UNETA 21 work, and also with the joint actions that were before UNETA 21. And what is in line with the regulation, that we should consider the JCA report as valid documents in our national assessments. Of course, we'll do the same judgment for the Nordic work. And this means that if there's a JCA report available for a product with the relative effect assessed, we will use this relative effect as basis for the Nordic health economic evaluation. So if you go to the next slide, please. So this is a kind of a simplified picture of the process. The process starts with that the company sends an application to EMA for market authorization, and at the same time the JCA process is initiated, and the JCA assessor and co-assessor sends the PICO survey to the member states, who replies to the survey. The PICO is consolidated, and this is the basis for what the dossier should address. And then we perform the assessment, and the report should be finalized by the latest 30 days after the market authorization. And with the connection to JNHB, we think this will facilitate our process, because if we have a joint JCA process, we at an early stage have decided what is the relevant PICO and comparator in each of the Nordic countries. So we already have this information, so this could help us prepare and decide if this is a product that would be relevant for a joint Nordic assessment. And I think that you could go to the next slide, please. I think that was, this was just kind of a summary of our goals going forward. I think the knowledge sharing part is of high importance to us, and we want to do high quality assessments. We have an ambition to increase the number of joint assessments going forward. And of course, knowledge sharing also connects very closely to that we have an ambition to decrease the divergence in methodology and evidence requirements between the countries. And also the transparency of the work is something that we put a lot of emphasis on. And of course, I think both on national and Nordic level, we do a lot of adaptations now to meet the requirements of the upcoming HTA regulation. Yes, and I think that was my final slide.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Maria. Very clear, and I think it's really important to also look into the connection with the EU HTA. I would immediately hand over to the next speaker, because I also understand, Alina, that we will take questions later on. We have a few questions in the Q&A section, but we will take them probably later on. So with that, I would hand over to Professor Kimmo Porkka, professor at Personalized and Cancer Medicine, Chief Physician at the University of Helsinki, to look into a topic which is very relevant for the initiative Real-World Evidence for Decision, which is the role of real-world evidence in HTA payer national collaborative initiative. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Alexander, and thank you also for the invitation to this very interesting webinar. So in the next few minutes, I would like to discuss with you so what we need to do, that the very rich clinical data that we every day collect at the clinical care sites could be used for HTA purposes and regulatory purposes much more directly than we can do today. So maybe first just a few definitions. So what I mean by real-world data here is mostly the data that we collect at the hospital sites, from the EHR records, and also from some of the generic databases that we generate then from that data, but mostly directly from the electronic health records. And there obviously would be very many different use cases for this data: clinical, drug development use cases, and also things like digital phenotyping. But in this context, so the question is that how useful this information and in which form this would be for HTA work. So if we truly want to scale this up, as many of the diseases that we deal with are rare diseases, and even the common ones like cancer is being dissected now into hundreds, if not thousands, of different subgroups of patients, meaning that many of the diseases will be very, very small, meaning also that we need to network and scale the real-world generation maybe in a totally different way. And one of the first prerequisites for that is data interoperability, and that's quite natural, but that's maybe the hardest part of this. And also that we probably need to do much more when we do analytics, that we need to standardize, that we do it in the same way everywhere, especially regarding the newer models like neural networks, machine learning, and so on. And I think the next, like the technical infrastructure we mostly have in most sites, and we actually have a lot of networking already going on within EU as an example. But indeed, the data interoperability is a really tough question that we need to address. Once you've done that, so then you can truly start doing very close to real time, asking very close to real time questions on these data sets and these networks, and you can get the results in a couple of days in the best scenario. You can easily repeat this, you can automate the system, and this is the way to truly provide reliable, transparent, and reproducible evidence for different use cases. And you can easily scale this up to very, very large groups of patients, which is, like I said, especially relevant for rare diseases and cancer. And today, as we know, so there's a lot of issues in exchanging or sharing primary patient-level data. And this, when you do it this way, that you do data federation, meaning that you only actually share the analytical code, but not the actual patient-level data. So this type of setting is indeed privacy by design and truly GDPR and the upcoming EHTS compliant. And so in Finland, we started the data interoperability project now like 4 years ago, and chose the OMOP common data model as our data model, that we would all harmonize first all the secondary care sites, the university hospitals, but also the national registries that are being maintained. And we actually now relatively advanced. We have 3 sites. The biggest hospitals now are in production use. with the harmonized data sets, but also the other sites will be completed by the end of next year. And also most of the big governmental registries have already been converted to the same model, and we have started doing now these type of network studies. And we hope indeed by the end of next year that we would have a population-based network of harmonized data. And as you know, so also at the EU level, there are similar initiatives. I think the most important one is the Darwin EU, sponsored by EMA. And there's a strong also Nordic presence here in Finland, Norway, and Denmark. And the first, so we all joined early this year, and the first studies are now ongoing, and I think this is a really important way of advancing these types of technologies, and I think will be, at least I believe it will be quite transformative. So we recently did sort of like a mini Darwin study funded by CITRA, which is a governmental innovation fund. And sort of like the client was Fimea, that's the Finnish competent authority. And we had the FINOME of the harmonized data network then providing the data or the evidence. And Fimea defined quite exact 3 case examples that we would use in this pilot, which one was a myeloma drug, the daratumumab bispecific antibody, and there were descriptives, but also on outcome questions there. And then there's a CAR T-cell treatment that's a rare treatment for some of the hematological cancers. And also then the spinal muscular atrophy. It's a very rare disease, so the questions were on demographics, but also new drug use. Then because this was done in a federated way, so we do analytical scripting that was mostly actually done by our local data teams, but we got some help from a CRO called Medafcon. And what we aimed here was simply that we were just testing whether this type of data model or data harmonization would be useful in this setting. And also just a combination of data federation and a harmonized data model, whether this would provide fit for purpose data to be an additional evidence for HTA or payer purposes. And obviously we wanted to see that where this would work and where this isn't work, and where we need much more new stuff to be developed. So what we learned now in this quite short pilot was that the information that Fimea requested was mostly available from these sites and in this setting. So indeed, we did this in a federated way. We didn't share any data, patient-level data. We only shared the aggregate data now with Fimea, and then the actual analysis was then done on an aggregate data level by Fimea. And that actually worked very nicely. And the usability currently, we think that especially for the budget impact calculations, meaning the number of patients that we have, so demographic type of data, but also describing the target population regarding the treatments. And there are still challenges in truly assessing exactly the impact or value of treatment and resource use. But overall, I think it was a very positive experience, I think, for all sites, and also one of the lessons learned that we need very granular data at the hospital setting. Of course, we have that, but that needs also to be mapped to the data model, and it has to reflect, of course, the indications of use of that medical device or drug. And what we learned also that this is a new setting, and there's a lot of local, I would say, legislation interpretations and differences in that, and that needs a lot of streamlining, that we can do this in a very quickly and efficient way. But overall, I think we all felt that this was a very interesting and very exciting collaboration, and I think we are going to continue with the next pilot cases, and at least I'm quite confident that these type of data sets could be quite useful directly also for the HTA purposes. So a group effort of a very large groups of people and hospitals in in Finland, but especially now this collaboration with FIMEA has been really fruitful. Thank you for that. And so thanks. This was all that I thought of discussing with you. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Kimmo. That was indeed very interesting, very practical example, and also highlighting that it's very much about the quality of the data, interoperability of data, so that it can be reused, and that has been quite helpful. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to Tove Holm Larsen to get us into the next panel discussion on the national perspectives on the use of real-world evidence or real-world data. And we would then come back later on, as promised, with Q&A with questions where we will address all your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Yes, we will zoom further in now that Kimmo has already started the focus on how can we use real-world data and real-world evidence. Then we are going to zoom further into the national perspective on the use of it. So we will start by introducing two additional panel members. And first of all, I would like to introduce Christian Delendorf, who is a biostatistician and chief consultant at the Danish Medical Council. And thank you for being here today, Christian. Would you start by helping us understand how you use real-world data in Denmark for HTA, for innovative medicine?
Yes, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the presentation, Tove. So as Em also mentioned, and also I think Maria mentioned, that the current setup is that the companies provide us with all the evidence. They provide an evidence package. So what we consider is all the evidence that the health technology developer delivers to us. And that also includes real-world data, real-world evidence. And that is everything from patient characteristics to external control arms. It could be natural history type of data. Specifically for rare diseases, we often see that setup, that we have some natural history data, and that's sort of the way to try to get the relative effectiveness estimated. So that's some of some of the uses of real-world data. And in terms of the relative effectiveness, it's just important to notice that when we are using external data, then of course it's challenging because it's external and it's indirect, unanchored comparisons, and it's quite different types of data that are compared. So trial data compared with what is going on in the real world. That's very challenging, but sometimes that's also the only feasible solution when you have like single-arm studies on a very small patient group. So yeah, so what we typically see is data from other countries. So it's not so often that we see data based on Danish data, for example, unless it's something about the patient demographics of Danish patients or the characteristics. Yeah, so we see all kinds of data, but typically for relative effectiveness, it's going to be based on other sources. It's typically US data, for example, Flatiron and so on. Yeah, so that's.
Sorry, Christian. Do you ever get so talking about joint Nordic cooperation? Do you ever get merged data from all of the Nordic countries to ensure that you have a minimum group of patients?
I can't remember seeing that, but that would, I think, in many cases, I think that would be preferable if because it's more close to what we want to look at in terms of patient characteristics. The challenge could be that if we're comparing with trial data and that trial is far away from Danish patients or Nordic patients, that could be a challenge in terms of the direct estimates. And then, of course, there's the transportability to the Nordic population afterwards. But I think in general, we would like to have like Nordic data because it's closer to the target population. And I think that the Nordic countries are quite similar. So I think that would be ideal.
Excellent. Cool. Thank you, Christian. We are also gonna introduce the last panel member, Lars Møller, who's Access and Value Find Cluster Lead and Managing Director in Pfizer Denmark. And Lars, now we've heard a lot from the authorities and all the joint assessment. What does it look like from the industry perspective in terms of real-world data?
Yeah. Thanks, Will. Thanks for introduction. And again, I'm really excited to be here and have this opportunity to really speak a little bit how we in the industry look at the world. And I might want to start with just giving you a few numbers and referring a little bit the FPA 2023 weight indicator survey. There's all kind of beliefs around this study, but it is definitely sure that it is conclusive in demonstrating an increasing demand to obtain access in innovative medicines. It's definitely becoming more and more difficult, and especially if we look at the medicines in oncology and also rare diseases such as ATMPs. So if I were to run a couple of numbers, if we look at Danish patients' access to new oncology drugs in the period from 2019 to 2022, it was actually only 20%, 27% of these drugs that was actually fully available to Danish patients. If we look at Finland, the same number would be 27%. It was 29% in Sweden, and it's 44% in Norway. If we look at orphan drugs, it's even more disturbing to look at the numbers. In Denmark, 24% of all new innovative drugs for rare diseases, 17% in Norway, 13% in Finland, 10% in Sweden. So what we see here is clearly a tendency that access is becoming more and more demanding in all the Nordic countries. And it's quite a dramatic drop, actually, that we see going forward. We did actually a little bit of a desktop survey in Pfizer Denmark, where we looked at all the approvals and the non-approvals that have been in the Nordic markets over a number of years. And it was clear that in the absence of standard of care already established, and if the patient numbers were decreasing, this was correlated to an unsuccessful outcome at HTA decisions, which is, I mean, this speaks into a little bit of the issue and the need to actually incorporate probably data from alternative sources as real-world evidence. This is worrying because in any efficient healthcare system, I believe medicines is a cornerstone. And if we pride ourselves, and we do that in the Nordics, of having some of the world's best healthcare system, we simply need to reflect to this development here, and we need to discuss what we can do about it. We all know that in the Nordic markets, we have very successful, I guess, introduced HTA evaluation bodies over the years. And it is, of course, to secure that we actually get most value of our healthcare budgets. And in Pfizer and as the industry as such, we can clearly subscribe that it's important to have a rational and evidence-based approach. But the question is basically, have maybe budgets become too tight to really allow that we get access for the best medicines available that the industry provides? That's in essence not the debate of today. That's a political debate. We'll need to take that another day in another narrative. But what we can look at is that those HTA evaluation bodies, the pay institutions, in their quest to really, deliver on the evidence-based approach, maybe have they become a little bit too focused in delivering these promises, and maybe to some extent this has some consequences for access for some of the best and new innovative medicines. If this is the case, I mean, one of the reasons could be the fact that the diseases and innovative medicines increasingly are being fragmented and segmented into smaller entities, where patient populations are becoming increasingly smaller. And we know all that this is definitely the truth for personalized medicine and ATMPs. Really small numbers there. So decreasing number of eligible patients, of course, make it both difficult for us as an industry, but also HTA bodies, to use and apply the methodology that we have developed to secure that we have the right clinical outcomes. And this cannot be derived from random clinical trials alone. I think also we have seen that many of the drugs that we actually now are producing and bringing to market, because they are so fragmented and personalized, they also become extremely efficacious. And it takes a long time to actually derive to these normal outcome performance measurements that we look upon, like PFS and overall survival for cancer therapeutics. And evidently also for ATMPs, especially when we talk about gene therapies, it takes a long time before we actually are really able to deliver on those outcomes that we normally associate with clinical effect. So I think this makes a strong case that we need to generate these data from other sources. And of course, real-world evidence is something where we can actually tap into to make sure that we have additional data that can secure this evidence solutions that we all are looking for. And I guess, again, the Nordic countries, with all our rich registers and long legacy, actually, to use this data, we are extremely well positioned to do this. And we are already doing this. Also in Pfizer, we have had many examples where we have delivered real-world evidence in connection with the normal data. And I think we have multiple situations where I think, having these data were basically one of the decisive factors for have a positive outcome. So we are clearly in favor of real-world evidence generation. We are really welcoming to be able to submit across geographies, so we can generate data on a Nordic basis, and we would really welcome commitment also in the JNHB that we actually these data will be used in going forward. So this is something we look for, and also, like Christian, I think, alluded to before, we have seen, I think, should we call it, a little bit of a limited appetite to actually use data that was not generated locally. But I think the discussion we have today is hopefully taking this in another direction. One important thing is also regarding our quest to find that we have a more direct link between cost and efficacy. I think we're looking to implement innovative funding models, and I think here real-world evidence plays a very significant role in here, so that we are able to follow patients over time, see how they progress, and also to be able to gather all those effects that the medication will do. So what is patients' availability for the job market, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is open for a discussion also to include dynamics effects into a way of evaluating drugs. So I think this is our perspective. We are very positive. We look to have the further commitment from our collaborators, and this is the way we are looking to go down this way. Of course, in the end, we also have to make sure, of course, we get all the data developed and evaluated in a standardized and completely transparent manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lars. What we will do now is we will go into a panel discussion, and with Lars's quest for some answers here on how we can cooperate, I'm sure we'll have a really good panel discussion. I will ask a couple of more questions, and while I'm doing that, please feel free to use the Q&A to ask any questions, and then we will pose all the questions from the audience to the panel in a few minutes. So please feel free to write a lot. I know from other meetings that you can be very active in the chat and in the Q&A. So feel free to ask any questions of relevance for the panel. But I think the first question for the whole panel could be, so now we've heard Christian saying that real-world evidence is nice, but you are often met with US data and not Nordic data. And we hear Lars saying that it's difficult to get real-world data included in the trials. Yet we all seem to agree that we have some of the world's best data in the Nordic registries. So what are the low-hanging fruits here? How can we make sure to integrate real-world evidence more, or Nordic real-world evidence more, or is the question that we don't really find it that relevant or interesting? So any low-hanging fruit? Anybody but Lars who want to answer that question, because I'm sure Lars wants to.
Yeah.
I can say something, but I mean, in the current setup, the companies are providing the evidence. So I guess the low-hanging fruit is that the companies see whether they can get this type of evidence, because I mean, they provide the data to us as we speak. So that's the one way in terms of the evidence that we get. In a longer perspective, we could also think of monitoring all the sort of recommendations that have been done in the Nordic countries, and then see whether we actually get the effect that the companies suggest. So maybe some of these risk sharing agreements could come into play in terms of following up on recommendations. So that's one way to think of it, maybe. But that is of course very challenging to do. So you have to define sort of the outcomes and the population and so on, and it should be aligned across countries, and you have all the legal things. I know with the Finnish experience that there are some methods to sort of get around this, but I think if it's rare diseases, personalized medicine, then you have very few persons or patients. And then you may come into issues anyway regarding the number of patients. So it will be too small, maybe. And then, yeah. So there are many possibilities, I think, but also a lot of challenges in this field.
So,
Kimmo, do you also? Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. So because I'm a bit of an outsider of this now, so. I think what Lars said, I think is really relevant and really, really interesting too as well. But I'm just wondering that as you mentioned, that you get the evidence from the HTTs, from the drug companies, and that's the only evidence that you consider. But would it be, if you think about the future, would it be even possible that you'd have a direct access to these type of registries or data sets, then you could also do the assessments yourself directly on the data? In a very similar way what Darwin does now, that they ask questions and they get the results back in a couple of months, which are very similar questions that you do in the HTA work.
Yeah, I think the main challenge is the timelines here. So for Joint Nordic, you have like 90 days. So you don't have months to wait for data. So that's definitely a challenge, and also the amount of resources that we have is going to be challenging. But of course, we have, at least in the Danish Medicine Council, we have access to Danish registry data. So in principle, we could look at some of the things, but yeah, I think the timelines are a bit short.
Maria, do you have a point?
Yes, I wanted to comment on what you said about the low-hanging fruit. And I think we do use real-world evidence to a quite large extent nationally at TLV. And then, I mean, the low-hanging fruit in that sense would be looking at registries for prevalence of a disease, and I mean, how many patients do we have with the specific disease, and how long, what are they treated with, and for how long are the patients treated, and do they switch to a different medication and so forth. And for that type of data, I think we have quite good coverage, at least for certain disease areas. And this is data that we would normally collect ourselves from our HTA body. And this is a real-world data that we use and make our reports and assessments more solid. So that's to me that's the low-hanging fruit. And then of course, when you want to collect the external control arms and so forth, then there's a completely different challenge, and coming to the quality of the data and so forth.
Lars, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I just in the presentation that we had from the JNHB by M, I didn't see any kind of comments regarding the real world use of the real world evidence, Nordic common real world evidence. And if we look at the methodology guidelines for each of our market, I think in every guidelines there are passages around how we would use real world data in each market. It's just a question: do we have a similar guidance in the JNHB guidance, or because I don't think it's there right now. Is that correct?
Yeah, sorry, I just had to unmute. Yeah, it's not specifically there right now, because we have just went through all our methodological stuff and to see what deviates, and at this point we haven't identified that we deviate at this thing. And also part of the methodology will be probably described in the HTA regulation, or at least partly covered. Yeah, for now we haven't identified any differences, but I agree it wasn't described.
Because I think that would be something that would be, interesting to see, that we have that in the guidelines, in the methodology guidelines to reflect. So that would be also something that would urge us to probably generate more of these and across Nordic perspective.
Yeah, but as far as it's covered by the EU regulation, then we will of course follow those guidelines. But for the health economic evaluations, there might be something with the extrapolation where at least previously seen real-world data used as an argumentation for choosing either extrapolation, and that's of course mainly based on the comparator arm usually, and also I've seen Nordic data used, but also other data from other countries. But as Christian also explains, we are relying on, at this point at least, what the company sent to us, and sometimes it's feasible with the Nordic patients, at least if they are similar to the patients in the clinical trials, but that's also something to consider. But either way, it's good to have real-world data from Nordic patients to validate or evaluate the choices in the health economic model. I think that's valuable in either way, but it's not always that we get that. I think it's rarely, in my opinion. I don't know if you have the same opinion, Christian.
Thanks.
Otherwise, we can also just hear if Maria has got the same impression from Sweden.
I was thinking, we don't have joint guidelines for the Nordics for use of RWD, and we don't have national guidelines either how to use real-world evidence in our assessments. But we do refer to what NICE and the Canadian agency has developed, since they have very good guidelines in our opinion. So coming to the quality of data and the analysis and so forth, I think we would use their guidelines to guide us. And also, as Em said, that with the regulation, at least in some extent, there's a bit of guidance in the documents that is adopted by the coordination group. And of course, we will use those as well. So in that sense, I don't think there's a need to develop an additional guideline either for Sweden or a joint Nordic guideline, since there's quite good coverage of high quality guidelines out there already.
And there are relatively recent guidelines also from the EMA on using real-world data.
I'm now going to open up the floor for, and I can see that there's ticking a lot of questions in for the panel. So Alexander, I think you've taken a look at that. Will you open the floor for the Q&A?
Indeed. Thank you very much, Tove. Thanks for a very good discussion. I'd like to open the floor for questions, and I would start off with one which is in the chat, which is a bit about the demarcation to other procedures like Beneluxa. And please come forward if you want to ask questions directly here. Please come forward with your questions in a minute. But let me first ask the first question, which I have in the chat, which is my understanding is that the Beneluxa initiative works similarly to JNHB. Has there been any discussion with them on how to solve issues which both organizations may face? So is there an interaction with other initiatives yet? I don't know who wants to take this one.
No, we have had a bit of contact, but not that much. And I think the major difference between us and the Benelux initiative is that was more a top-down initiative coming from the political side from the beginning. So they have a bit of a different mandate in the collaboration than we do. But we have had occasional meetings. But then it also comes back to kind of information sharing and so forth. So we haven't really developed that further.
Great. Any question from the audience? Anyone else who wants to come forward to ask a question? Not the case? Okay, then I would continue with the questions in the Q&A section. There is a question on the dialogue meetings that Im mentioned, and the question is whether those include a discussion of how to use real-world evidence in the joint assessment. I think you mentioned something, Im, in the beginning in your presentation about this, how real-world evidence is used in the joint assessment. Is there any methodology behind it? What type of data gaps have you identified to use real-world evidence? Are there specific areas? Is it more like for a specific type of product where real-world evidence plays a role, like orphan medicines or ATMPs? Or I don't know.
Yeah, I can try to answer. I think, of course, we can talk about such things as well in the dialogue meeting, but I assume that we would refer to those guidelines that was also mentioned before, the ones that are internationally recognized and so on, and also, of course, say that we prefer clinical trial data, but if relevant and necessary, and if that's all that is feasible, we will look into the real-world data sent if we're talking about an external control arm, for instance. But we could, of course, give some guidance also for the extrapolations and everything. But it's a non-binding guidance either way. So, but I think all topics could be discussed. But for this issue, I think we mainly refer to guidelines. That's at least my thought.
And any other thought from the colleagues? Not the case. Okay. Before I continue with the other questions, I would have another question on the demarcation to the EU HTA. Because the EU HTA, as we all know, comes into play, at least for some products, oncology indications and ATMPs, on the 12th of January next year. So it's not too far away. And the EU HTA only focuses on the clinical effectiveness, while your process, at least I heard it once, would also contain the cost effectiveness part if it's relevant in your country. Maria, can you elaborate a little bit further on, like, where is the demarcation? What your process run in parallel? Would it be forming a joint communication about what could be a PICO scheme in the EU HTA? So is it ahead or is it after that? So just in general, and also is the scope just wider in your process? So just to illustrate a bit more, like, where is it coming into play when it comes to the EU HTA?
Okay, so I'll try to answer. So if we have for a product that is covered by the joint clinical assessment, I mean, the PICO will be determined very early in the process. So each country needs to decide the PICO of their PICO and what is the treatment landscape and the comparator and so forth. And that's something that we put a lot of emphasis on in the Nordic collaboration in order to have an efficient joint process, we want the comparator to be similar enough. Otherwise, we would advise the company to go for the national assessment instead. So I think the benefit from the direct benefit from the joint work would be that we know the PICO at an early stage, because then we have done this assessment on national level, and then we know if the product is feasible for a joint health economic assessment. As you said, then the clinical part will be done already on the European level, and we just need to add the health economic part of the work. So that will be the joint Nordic work.
Okay. So it's of course not meant to replace the EU HTA, but to come up with additional data sets which are required for your respective countries and HTA bodies, right?
Yes, no, it's not meant to replace the JCA. I think both the national and Nordic level, I mean, the JCA comes first, and then the relative effect assessment from the JCA report is used in the national health economic evaluation.
Okay,
and this is also the wording of the regulation that each member state needs to have the due consideration to the JCA report when available. So that's something that we're obliged to do.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and maybe I can add according to the work, because I think a lot of our work is about the health economic modeling. If we have a cost utility analysis, so even though the JCA replaces the clinical part and the relative effectiveness, there's still a lot of work to do. It's not just a little thing that's left, I would say. So there's still a lot to collaborate on for these drugs.
Right. I just wanted to make clear, like, where is the demarcation to the EU HTA, and that made it very clear. Thanks for that. We have a few questions in the chat still. When we're speaking about real-world evidence in JNHB, how important would you consider that the pharmaceutical companies discuss the real-world evidence study design and the fit whether it's fit for purpose for your organization in that early stage in a consultation meeting? So is it appropriate, like really when we're only looking at real-world evidence, to come early to seek scientific advice with you, to discuss the study design for real-world evidence? How important is that interaction? I don't know who wants to go first. Maybe one of the other colleagues involved. Christian, is that something you want to answer, or Eam, or I'll leave it up to you?
I think generally it's quite important that the design and the data are fit for purpose. Whether that will be part of the Joint Nordic process, I'm not so sure, because I think much of this will at least be, to some extent, be covered by the joint clinical assessment at the EU level, I think. Yeah, but I mean, otherwise, there are guidelines for how to do real-world evidence studies and also how to evaluate fit for purpose and so on. So I think there are a lot of guidelines out there that one could consult.
Okay, but in general, there is the opportunity for an interaction before trial design. If I'm not sure, there's the option for scientific advice in your group, right?
I think there's no option for advice, at least not in the Danish Medicines Council, and I don't think in JNHB, but the JCA or the regulation has an advice function. But I agree, you don't have at least in Denmark, we don't have a specific advice function. But I think in general, when the dossier is sent, it's of course very important that all these things are described about the feasibility and so on. But at least in Denmark, we don't have advice functions for this. But some of it may be covered by the regulation, the JSC.
Yeah, the JSC has limited slots, of course. We in industry, we are very often pointing to the fact that these discussions are quite important in the beginning. But I mean, this is really a much more narrow focus here. If when it comes to real-world evidence and whether there are scientific consultations or scientific advice, I don't think that's even feasible in many other countries and jurisdictions that you seek scientific advice for real-world evidence generation. But maybe it's something which is for the future. So what about Sweden on this one? Maria, nothing foreseen as well, right?
No, well, TLV doesn't give scientific advice either. currently. We do have a very limited availability for parallel advice with our regulatory MPA, Medicines Product Agency. But that wouldn't really be anything specific for real-world evidence. And also, I think, I mean, if it comes to data supporting the clinical effect of a product, that really would, I think the joint scientific consultations under regulation would be the most relevant, since that would be the correct timing, most likely for collecting advice.
Good, great. More general question I have here. In your pilot projects, what processes did you use to determine your outcomes to measure? Not sure who wants to take that one. Outcome measurement in pilot projects. Is that something you can talk about? And the following questions, are there results and reports about the pilot studies publicly available yet?
What pilot studies are you referring to?
I think it's for chemo, maybe.
Don't you think
okay.
chemo is it's his
Yeah, it's
pilot?
for chemo.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, because the outcome definitions can be very challenging in especially in oncology, and the challenge is also that it's very disease specific. So you need to do a lot of work to get the outcomes in the way that you want, but it's totally doable, but it's not easy. And also that the international recommendations are often not really applicable to the data that we have in the real world setting. So I think you can get 95% there just with the real world data, but quite often not 100% based on the very strict or the way the responses are defined. But it's
Okay,
one of the biggest challenges, yes.
Okay. Good. I have a question for Lars from Pfizer. What do you think is the value of Darwin EU to help increase the utilization of real-world evidence? And what would you, as a representative of industry, like Darwin EU, to be used for when it comes to health technology assessments?
I simply think my knowledge about Darwin is not good enough to actually answer that question, to be honest. So I have to refrain from that one. But no, I would not be able to say anything about that.
Okay. I mean, I think Darwin EU is an initiative by the European Medicines Agency, which looks more into regulatory data and real-world evidence. So is there anything you could say about real-world regulatory data, how it could be used in HTA decision-making processes?
Yeah, I mean, on a more general basis, I think this is extremely important. Basically, as I think I started in the beginning saying, I think we are in a situation where we need additional avenues to data to be able to supplement to what we already have done. And this is, of course, because things are developing so fast. I mean, the way we generate drugs and the way we stratify our medicines now, I think to some extent we're setting a little bit of up HTA bodies up for not failure. That would be a wrong word, but get me right. I mean, we are actually things are going so fast that there is a need to be able to deliver additional data, which is not in the normal methodology today. So I think we have to look at these avenues to get these data. So I think anything here would be important for us, and I think also the dialogue with you is very important. So we actually generate the right data. I think that's critical. And this is also why I think it's a great discussion here, and I think it's important that we also get that, if you want to say, commitment also from the HTA bodies that we will be able to use data generated in Nordic in several markets, because I think that would actually increase our opportunity to deliver more of these data. I think this is a critical one.
And if I may quickly comment on this, I think it's exactly that it's for these rare diseases and things that we will never get phase 2 or 3 evidence from the clinical drug trials. So that's really, but one of the important functions for Darwin is data standardization and developing new methods for analysis, and that's a very big grade. So developing regulatory grade analytics is a really big part of Darwin, so that you can truly trust the evidence that will be generated from the data.
Thank you so much, both. I see, oh, Alexander is back.
Sorry, I lost connection.
Thanks for not leaving. Just a quick question also from Karen Facey in the chat. Would real-world evidence from one Nordic country be acceptable in another country in the JNHB? And I hand back to the moderators.
But I could start and you could fill in. But I think, I mean, it's always difficult to answer such specific questions, because of course this will need to assess on a case-to-case basis. But in general, as we mentioned before, that the Nordic countries are quite similar to the treatment landscape. So it would most likely be easier to transfer or translate the data from one Nordic country to another than perhaps from China or something where the treatment landscape differs a lot.
Yeah, I also just say that, of course, it's also depending on the data quality, not only the country of origin, but of course you have maybe a better starting point if it's closer resembling the country of interest. And there we are more similar in the Nordic countries, but it can still be the data quality should still be high enough and good enough and comparable to what is actually needed. So I think that's important.
Good. Any other comment on this one? Otherwise, I would have a final question from the Q&A section, which is more on the practical side of things. Nothing else. Then I would have this last question. Is the Nordic registry open? I think that means the collaboration. Is it open to collaborating with industry, pharmaceutical companies to enhance the timely generation of real-world evidence? And if so, who should be contacted for more information? So how to engage with you, and to what extent can we put forward questions around real-world evidence in that format, and who is a contact person? Any volunteer on this last one?
I'm not sure I'm following the question exactly. Is it for the JNHB collaboration or not?
It says a Nordic registry, but I would assume it's probably the initiative. So whom would I contact if I have a question around this, and if I want to get in touch on regarding the generation of real-world evidence? Is there any contact person in the organization?
If it's about the generation of data, I don't think that's anything to do with the Joint Nordic assessment, as far as I understand it. The question, if it's regarding the process, then you could go to the website of JNHB to see and then follow that process. But in terms of Nordic registries, I think that's no sort of point of contact as far as I understand it.
Okay, clear. So hand back over to you, Alina, then. That was the last question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we have a final question now to all the panelists. In future, what one thing could support the use of real-world evidence in joint HTA in the Nordics? You have each 1 minute, please, for your wrap-up remarks.
Yeah, I can go then. I think for us, the clear commitment, if you wish, in the form of a guidance in JHBA methodology guidance that real-world evidence generated in one country could be used in others, or could be part of the submissions to evaluation in a JNHB setting. that would open for us an opportunity to be able to involve us even more in this. I think the company I represent is an international company, and they see the Nordic area as a highly interesting area with a strong legacy, as we discussed before, in registering and generating these data. So just any kind of commitment in the guidance in JNHB, that would be tremendously helpful for us to engage even stronger in generating RWD in this area.
Thank you, Lars. Kimo, would you like to go next? You're muted.
Sorry. So thanks. So I think it would be really useful because there's a lot of things happening also in the Nordic context in this space. So for example, the Nordic Ministry Council has just launched the VALO initiative, where they collect in the oncology space now real world data in a very Darwin-like way, and testing that whether that would work in these types of settings as well. So that would be, because there's no Nordic registry, that was the speaker asking before, but it would be relatively, I mean, there would be a big need for that, obviously. And what Lars said also, I'm a clinician, so seeing that you get less and less, there are longer times of getting drugs approved, and less and less drugs end up in the patient care. So that worries us in the clinical side as well. And I think as the numbers are so small, we need very good real world data and need to work together.
Thank you very much. Em, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I think it's difficult just to point one thing, because I think in general we are using real evidence in all assessment of both national and also joint. If they are sent to us, that's at least one thing that should be supporting the use, is that we actually get it from the company. And of course, I don't know how difficult it is to get access to the registers and to make the actual analysis of the Nordic data or European data, if that's also could also be feasible. So maybe if the companies could use this opportunity and send it to us together with the dossier, that could support the use of it.
Thank you very much. And Christian, also from Denmark.
Yeah, I agree. And some of the challenges historically has been sort of combining data sources across the Nordics due to legal issues usually. And I think maybe some of the things that Kimo talked about could potentially make analysis more feasible, because even though we have good registries and so on in Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and so on, we are not so large in populations. For rare diseases, it's going to be very challenging to rely on only Danish data, for example.
Very interesting. And Maria, you have the last word.
I mean, I do agree that we do use real world data, both on national and Nordic level, and I mean, and of course, I mean, a prerequisite is that the companies do submit real world data for us to assess. But I think so we do use it, but I think a challenge is the data quality. I mean, we want to make our decisions as certain as possible. So coming back to, I mean, the quality of the data and the transparency in how and what the data covers that's something that we ask for. So that we could have, I mean, that the decisions are made as certain as possible, decreasing that part.
Thank you all so much. That was a great discussion, and wonderful to see such an engaged audience. Sorry we couldn't answer all your questions, but let's continue the discussion about the use of real-world evidence in HTA-impaired decision-making at the Real-World Evidence for Decision Symposium on 14th of November. This will take place in Brussels, but we can also connect online. There's a link in the chat for you to register. We are very excited about the symposium this year because we will be launching the revised real-world evidence for decisions actions to generate better real-world evidence for HTA payers. These actions propose recommendations to all the stakeholder groups you see here. from HTA payers to clinical teams, registry holders, industry, patients, and analytics experts. And hope to see many of you there. And finally, a big thank you to our amazing speakers and co-moderators for their contributions today. And many, many thanks to the audience for stimulating the discussion, and to my colleagues in the Real World Evidence for Decisions Secretariat from behind the scenes. Do visit the Real World Evidence for Decisions website, where we will also upload the slides and the report from today's discussion. And please do follow us on LinkedIn to stay up to date with our activities. Thank you again, and wishing you all a lovely afternoon. Bye for now.